Hello guys, this is going to be a video explaining how to overclock the i5-3450. I believe that this should also be able to apply to the other i5 series besides the K models. The difference between the K model and the other series without the K at the end is just that the K model has a much more higher multiplier. So essentially you can overclock the K model all the way up to about 6.3 gigahertz, and that is pretty much near impossible. The more average and more likely overclock that you'll get on these K models is about 4.2 to 4.5 gigahertz, and usually around 5 gigahertz is more on the you need to water cool the CPU because you need to apply a lot of voltage to it, and that really gets it very hot. And usually there's no CPU heatsink that runs on air cooling that's going to adequately cool a i5 or even an i7 that's been overclocked above 4.7 gigahertz or even 4.6 gigahertz. So if it's above those gigahertz ranges, you really need to have water cooling. Now, basically, I'm going to try to alleviate some of the misconceptions here. My CPU is a Core i5-3450, and I have this window cut off purposely to show you guys something later, but I have a 3450, and there's a very huge misconception that if it's not a K model processor, it can't be overclocked, period. And also is a very huge misconception that you need to have a K series processor to have an adequate gaming PC, when this is just clearly a misunderstanding. So basically any quad core CPU essentially, as long as it's running at about 3.1 to 3.4 gigahertz on each core, it's not going to bottleneck anything in terms of gaming. It's not going to bother. It doesn't matter if you overclock a K series processor up to 4.9 or even 5 gigahertz. It's not going to offer any substantial and even not any improvement at all in your overall gaming performance, because gaming is really highly dependent on the graphics processing unit. The CPU can really only do so much, whereas the graphics processing unit handles the majority of the gaming workload. Now, if you're talking about workstation, a situation where you're just rendering or you're doing 3D modeling or anything that's very CPU intensive, then yes, overclocking a K series CPU will be highly more beneficial to you than just getting a non-K series CPU. So the Core i5-3450 here, it's rated at 3.1 gigahertz at its stock multiplier, and it can turbo up to 3.5 gigahertz. Look at what I'm having. Look at the gigahertz that I pretty much have it set to right now. So basically, I have it running at all times at 3.8, pretty much 3.85 gigahertz. And the way I pretty much approach this scenario is I had to sort of adjust the base clock, because if I basically the highest the multiplier can go up to is 3.9 gigahertz in the BIOS, and in the BIOS basically only the first two cores, core 0 and core 1, can run at 3.9 gigahertz. Then core 2 runs at 3.8 gigahertz, and then core 3 can only run up to 3.7 gigahertz. And then what this does is, usually there really isn't that many times where only two cores are being used. So if only two cores are being used, then those two cores will run at 3.9 gigahertz. If only three cores are being used, then all three cores are going to run at 3.8 gigahertz. And if all four cores are being used, which is what mostly always happens, they can only run at 3.7 gigahertz. So essentially, the entire architecture can only run as fast as the slowest core. So what I did was I set it to 3.7 gigahertz, which is pretty much the highest you can have it for, because it kind of counts in for all the cores. Then I adjusted the base clock, which sort of overclocked this up a bit more. I know this actually adjusts the speed for the PCI, the USB, the SATA controls, and all that, but I've been messing with this for a while, and I know that anything higher than the bus speed, or the base clock speed right here, anything higher than that, my computer will boot into Windows and everything, but the graphics card really doesn't perform at all. It just really, it doesn't get past about 20 frames per second in anything. So I know that the PCI is starting to become unstable, so I have to back it down. This has been for a good 3 days. of no problems whatsoever. The motherboard boots up and doesn't reset anything, so this pretty much looks like it's a stable base clock right here. So I'm gonna show you guys what I did in the BIOS to reach this overclock here. And essentially this overclock for this Core i5-3450 is an overkill for gaming. You don't need this much power from a CPU for gaming at all. Really, you don't. Don't let anyone tell you that you need like I said previously, that you need like a CPU running in the 4 gigahertz range. You really don't need that for gaming. This is just me overclocking this just for, like, you know, for overall workstation experience to improve that. And even if when I did overclock this, I really don't see much of a significant increase in speed over the stock. But I just want to get the most out of my CPU, even though it's not really giving me much of a real world results or anything like that. So I'm gonna show you guys how I overclock this in the BIOS using my camcorder, because I can't run fraps in the BIOS. So stay tuned for that. Hello guys, now we're in the BIOS and I'm going to show you guys how I overclocked my Core i5-3450 to reach about 3.85 gigahertz. So this is a UEFI type of BIOS where it allows you to use the mouse to navigate, as well as a keyboard for traditional usage. I believe that you'll need a Z77 chipset motherboard in order to overclock the Ivory Bridge CPUs. So please be assured that you have that before you even attempt to overclock. So now in my BIOS here, this is a BIOS start BIOS. You just go to this menu option right here, which is the overclocking area, in which you can overclock your CPU, overclock the RAM, and the voltage and all that other things. So what I have right now is I have the fixed CPU ratio set to a multiplier of 37, and then I have the CPU clock, or the base clock, set to 104.25 megahertz. I disabled the clock spread spectrum. I disabled the power saving functions for the CPU, and I also disabled the turbo boost, which is the Intel speed step technology. Let's go down. And this is the turbo boost multipliers, in which you can adjust, but I have that disabled, so that really doesn't matter. And this is for my specific overclocking, which I just previously showed you guys. And this is just the RAM. Pretty much I have it set to manual because I was just changing the multiplier, thinking that since the RAM runs at 1333 megahertz, and the base clock, since I overclocked that, I know it's going to increase the multiplier for this RAM. So I adjusted down a bit, thinking that the RAM might become unstable, and something just told me to just put it back to its stock speeds and then boot to Windows and see what happened. And like I said before, it's been about 3 days, and I haven't seen any blue screens with that indicating that the RAM is failing or anything. So the RAM is pretty much running sort of stable, a little bit above 1333 megahertz, which really shouldn't be that much of a problem. And then the voltage down here, I pretty much left to auto. So I let the motherboard pretty much handle the voltage, even though I know that this should be I know how much voltage you should be able to apply, but the motherboard sort of, you know, knows how to handle the voltage depending on what the CPU needs at that specific time. Because when I look at the CPU readout, which tells me what my CPU is doing, every time like the clocks, or anytime I do something intensive with the computer, I can see the voltage sort of fluctuate and increase. So the motherboard is essentially providing more voltage to the CPU when it needs it, but it usually just always hovers around 1.2 volts, which is pretty much within the safe threshold and providing for CPU. Also, the RAM voltage is set to auto as well. So what I'm going to do is just run two Cinebench tests, which is basically a program that has your CPU render an image, and basically the faster the CPU, the faster the image will be rendered, and it basically judges your CPU on a score. So I'm going to show you the Cinebench of my CPU on the on this current overclock that I have right here, running at 3.85 gigahertz, and then I'm going to show you the Cinebench of my CPU when it's running at stock speeds with the turbo boost applied to let it go up to 3.5 gigahertz. So stay tuned for that. Alright, so now we're booted into Windows and my CPU is currently overclocked, so I'm going to show you guys a Cinebench benchmark test with the overclock settings applied. As you can see up here in the Core Temp CPU gadget monitor. So let's click run over here. So essentially, basically before I hit run, this is just a program which renders an image right over here. This is not the image it renders, but it renders an image there, and what this does is basically it shows you how fast your CPU is, because the CPU is basically rendering the image without the help of the graphics card itself. So when this is done, it rates your CPU on a point scale. Basically, these are other CPUs that's been rated before. And the C's are basically how many cores these CPUs have, and the T's are basically how many threads the CPU is capable of processing at a time. So the Intel CPUs are capable of hyperthreading, which makes them process 2 threads per each core. So being that this is basically a 4-core CPU, it can process 8 threads. And this is the AMD Opteron, which has 12 cores and can only process 12 threads because the CPUs don't hyperthread or anything of that sort. And this is pretty much the score that they've gotten, and these are fairly fast CPUs. So let's see how my CPU ranks in between those. So my CPU was given a rating of 6.13 points, and basically it added it towards where the other CPUs were pretty much rated as well. So let's open this up a bit more so you guys can see. So compared to the older the i7, I believe this was the first generation i7s, which are still very, very fast processors. My Core i5 was able to outperform them. So pretty much this really is a satisfactory score, because the CPU that I have right now is essentially more powerful than what the average user would even need, especially in its overclocked state. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back here and run this same test with the CPU at stock speeds and see how it compares to the 6.13 point score that the overclocked state will provide. Alright, now the CPU is running at stock speeds. So let's run the test again. Also, one thing I wanted to point out was, you can see that at stock speeds, this rendering is really taxing on the CPU. And in the previous video where I had it overclocked, these bars were about 25% on each bar themselves. So the overclock really allows the CPU to multitask a lot more efficiently, which is kind of self-explanatory. Alright, so basically we got a score of 5.21 points. And in comparison to these same processors, I am more in line with the first gen Core i7s. So this is basically around a reduction of a complete point, basically. And it may not seem that significant to you guys, but in this specific benchmarking program, that's a very significant drop in a sense. But it's really up to a point where
it's like at around this around 5, I'll even say 4.5 points. It's pretty much adequate for gaming, and pretty much more than adequate for the daily and average user. So up into the even my 6 point range and higher than that, those are for like really workstation and very intensive CPU load scenarios. So if you guys have any questions or comments, feel free to ask in the comment box. I'll try to answer them to the best of my abilities. Thanks for watching this video, guys. Later.